All right, welcome to Boxy Banter. I'm your host, Billy Ballas, joined today by Terry Dewan, our resident Mets fan who has a unique point of view on the NL East, being a Mets fan. And we decided to bring him in today because the first episode of our quarter century roster is featuring the reigning World Series champion Washington Nationals. We decided to start with them, so welcome Terry to the program.
What's up, Billy? How you doing?
I'm doing well, as well as we can be during this pandemic with everything that's going on. But it's nice to be here with you to talk baseball. Can't talk any actual baseball that's going on, but it'll be nice to talk about some of the stuff of the Nats organization in the past 25 years. So, the Nationals, they were, of course, formerly the Expos. They were in Montreal as the Expos through 2004. Then they moved to Washington, D.C. in 2005. Looking at the stadiums that they've played in Montreal, they played in Olympic Stadium. As they moved to D.C. in 2005, they played in RFK Stadium for a few years from 2005 to 2007, moving into the brand new Nationals Park in 2008, and that's where they currently are. So they've been in Nationals Park from 2008 to the present. Again, going back to the Expos, in 1994, in that strike-shortened season, they were actually in first place. Of course, did not get to play in the playoffs that year. And, the rest of their time in Montreal from 95 through 2004, they did not have any playoff appearances. Then when they moved to D.C., the Nationals, their first 6 years, they finished in last place 5 out of their first 6 years. So 5 fifth-place finishes in their first 6 years. But then eventually they turned it around, and the Nats were division champs in 2012, 2014, 2016, and 2017. And then, of course, last year they were the wild card in the playoffs, and they went on to win the wild card game. Then they beat the Dodgers in the NLDS, beat the Cardinals, swept the Cardinals in the NLCS, and then, of course, that 7-game series, World Series, where they beat Houston to win the World Series. Any comments on the history of the Nats and Expos in the past quarter century?
Yeah, some of it. I don't really combine the two franchises for some reason. I don't know if that's how you feel too. I mean, when you're watching the Nationals now, are you conscious that they used to be the Expos?
Absolutely not. Certainly, teams move from time to time, and some teams definitely keep that history. The Dodgers and the Giants, but are two that come to mind. But they also kept their identity as
right.
The name, where they completely had a different rebrand. I mean, they moved countries too and everything. So that is an interesting point. But at least as far as this project goes, we got to include that to fill out the roster. Otherwise, that Nats team's only going to have half of a roster.
Oh, that's true. I didn't even think about that.
Now, as we get into some fun facts about the Expos and Nationals, we're going to start with a trivia question, and the trivia question will be answered in next week's show, but we may hear some guesses today. So, of course, the Nationals began play in D.C. in 2005. Who threw the first complete game in Nationals history? Do we have any guesses?
Just off the top of my head? Oh my gosh. That's a great... I mean, I'm going to go with like Levon Hernandez or something like that.
Okay. Is there any reason why you're choosing him?
He's a prominent guy that I can think of that was on the team around that time. I can't even remember if he was on the 05 team or if he's on the 06, 07.
Okay, well, I will say, I won't answer the question yet, but Levon Hernandez did start. He started the opening day for the Nationals in 05. So he was their opening day starter.
Okay.
Tune in next episode to find out if he did in fact throw the first complete game for the Nationals.
Sounds good.
Now, the Nationals, or the Expos, originally were owned by Claude Brocu from 91 to 98. Then Jeffrey Loria, you may not remember, but he actually owned the Expos from 98 to 02. And more on that in a moment. Then, of course, he sold the team to MLB, who the
That's
Nats
right.
and Expos, they were owned by the league
That's
from
right.
02 to 06 until Ted Lerner bought the team in 06, and he is the current owner. I mean, it's kind of hard to imagine the league owning a team today. I mean, this wasn't even that long ago.
Yeah, it was. You almost felt bad for the team at that time. They were rudderless. They had just moved in. They didn't have the beautiful ballpark built yet. They didn't have an owner. Refresh my memory. Did they have an expansion draft or anything like that?
No, because they weren't an expansion team.
That's right.
So they just everyone kind of shifted over.
Yeah, it was pretty bleak for them at the beginning.
Yeah. Now, when they did move to Washington, the first team president was Stan Kasten. Now, as an NL East guy, you of course are familiar with him as the architect of that Braves dynasty.
Yeah.
He built the Braves dynasty up. Then he was with the Nationals from 06 to 2010. And then now he's, of course, a part owner and team president of the Dodgers. So, he was kind of behind that huge Braves dynasty, helped build up the Nats. He wasn't there when they finally became successful, but he was definitely part of that rebuild. Then, when he took over as team president for the Dodgers, they were already successful, but he has just kept that train moving along. So Stan Kasten definitely has shown his success in those three organizations. Now, as we look at the managers, in Montreal, Felipe Alou was the manager from 92 to 01. The great Frank Robinson managed the Expos and then the Nationals from 02 to 06. So he was their first manager in DC. Davey Johnson was the manager from 2011 to 2013.
We love Davey Johnson.
He was the manager for their first division champion. Then Matt Williams in 2014 and 15.
We also love Matt Williams, but for a different reason.
Dusty Baker managed in 16 and 17. And Dusty Baker's had great success, has not been able to get that World Series ring, but just a 2-year run there. Then Dave Martinez in 2018 and 2019, he's their current manager. And Dave Martinez, of course, got his start. He was the Joe Maddon's bench coach in Tampa for a long time, and he was kind of one of those guys who people were projecting to be one of the next great managers.
Right.
And now, of course, a team that has struggled, one of the great places to rebuild, of course, is through the draft.
Right.
And the Nationals, of course, as we're going to look at in a moment, they definitely capitalized on that. Do you remember who their first draft pick was as the Nationals organization?
Well, I was going to say one thing quickly before we move on to the draft. Can we touch on the managers for just a second?
Absolutely.
All of those Nats teams had a different vibe depending on who they were coached by. And I remember, from the perspective of a fan of the opposing team, those Dusty Baker teams are really good. And I always felt like he got a raw deal because, it's now proven out that the playoffs are a crapshoot. And I feel like there was just so much pressure and so much frustration from them having the struggles in the postseason that, what did Baker win? Like 95 to 97 games in both of his years or whatever like that?
Yeah,
and they ran him out after they got dumped in the first round in a pretty hotly contested series, I think, too. Was that that was the one where they went, who did they play? Cardinals?
I
can't remember off the top of my head.
2017 was the Cubs. Or no. Yeah, 2017 was the Cubs.
Uh-huh.
Because then the Dodgers beat the Cubs in 5 games in
Right.
the NLCS. 2016, they lost. Maybe 2016 was the Cubs.
Maybe it was.
2016, I think it was. Might have been the Cubs.
2016
both years.
is the year the Cubs won it all, right?
It was, yeah, and it was. I think it was the Cubs both years because the Dodgers played the Cubs in both NLCSs.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, I just and then of course when they had Matt Williams, the first year they won 96 games with him, and they lost in the NLD.
Yeah, they lost to the Giants that year, I believe.
Okay, I think you're right. And then the next year is 2015, and they were just a complete mess, and they couldn't get out of their own way, which then led to Dusty Baker. But me just looking down the
you know what, I was right. I think 2016 was the Dodgers. That was when that epic 5-game series with the Dodgers.
Yep, you're right.
Yeah,
you're right. So it appears that they're kind of on an every other year thing here. We're forgetting another manager, by the way. Do you know who I'm thinking of as a Mets fan? Manny Acta. Manny Acta, if you talk about a guy who was like the up-and-coming hot prospect manager at the time, Manny Acta is the third base coach for the Mets in 06 when they won the division, and off of that he got the job, and he was sabermetrically inclined, and he had come up as a player, but through the scouting system he had been a bench coach, he had been a hitting coach, blah blah blah. And so he takes over the Nats after Frank Robinson, and they have some tough years when they're rebuilding, and he loses 100 games a couple of times, and then he didn't get a chance to see it through.
Yeah,
they went to Jim Riggleman, and then
he was the guy that kind of wore it, like the who was with the Cubs recently.
Who I was thinking of is like Bo Porter with the Astros. Like, you're the guy who's going to wear it while we're getting everything in house, and then the team's ready to win now. Oh, okay,
yeah.
I'll see you later.
Yeah, definitely.
Okay.
And then so as they did become to win, of course. So back to those draft picks.
Mm-hmm.
Any recollection on who the first national draft pick was? It was in that 05 draft. And if you look back at that 05 draft, the top of the 05 draft was loaded with some names.
I mean, is it Zimmerman?
It was Zimmerman.
Okay.
So Mr. National, the first draft pick in 05. And then, of course, we kind of touched on it just a moment in 09 and 2010. Back-to-back 1-1 picks, first overall. And both of those drafts featured guys who, it's pretty obvious who the top pick was going to be. Now, going back, you may have a different draft order, but going into those drafts, Strasburg in 09.
Unanimous.
And Harper in 2010.
The way they were talking about Strasburg was like he was like a Greek god or something like that. That like, this is the most polished college pitcher I've ever seen. He can do everything. He touches 100 miles an hour back when that was a novelty. You could take him right into the pros immediately. It was Strasburg was a sure thing. And then Harper, of course, we remember Harper, was 16 years old hitting balls off the top of the Trop in a home run derby, right? And he's on Sports Illustrated. And so they have these two guys that were like, there's no such thing as a slam dunk in the baseball draft, but you gotta love if you're drafting 1-1 and then there's a no doubt I have to take this guy. Nobody's gonna second guess me for taking this guy. So that's where I reference. You could see the Nationals coming. They draft those
Absolutely.
two guys, then they get Rendon, and you're just like, oh my gosh, these guys keep picking in the top half of the draft. It's gonna work eventually.
And then, as you just mentioned, Rendon was 6th overall in 2011.
Mm-hmm.
So in those 9, 10, and 11, you get Strasburg, Harper, and Rendon. That's a ton of talent that you're infusing into that organization, and that was what helped lead to their first division title in 2012.
And Rendon was sort of the top offensive player in that draft too. He may have just slipped up because he's a Boris guy or whatever, but
Yes. And then, so that was huge for them. But, we almost never had this conversation that we're having right now because if you remember, and getting back to the MLB owned team when MLB owned them, the Nationals, the Expos, were almost contracted. There's even a vote to contract the Twins, and the Rays were also considered for contraction. And then
It's too bad that didn't happen.
they narrowed it down to the Expos and the Twins. The league voted. It was 28-2 that they were going to contract. Of course, the two no votes were the Expos and the Twins. But then there was a series of events. John Henry bought the Red Sox, which he was the owner of the Marlins. So then he sold the Marlins to Loria, and then Loria sold the Expos to MLB. That's what kind of led to this whole thing, or it was part of it. But then also, with the Twins being one of the two teams, contracted, they were heavily involved in this. And the Metropolitan Sports Facilities Commission won an injunction requiring that the Twins play in the Metrodome in 2002. So they could not be contracted that year, so they had to play that out. And of course, you cannot get rid of just one team. Then you'd have 29 teams. In baseball, you need an even number.
Yeah.
So they cannot get rid of just the Expos at that point. Then it happened that the Players Union signed a new CBA that year in 2002. And the CBA, part of that was that they prohibited contraction until 2006. Then by 2006, the Expos, of course, had moved to Washington, become the Nationals, and the Twins made progress on building, what is now Target Field. So they were not really an option to contract anymore. And so now, as we know, we still have 30 teams. So the Expos and, now the Nationals are still around. So
That's interesting.
yeah, you kind of forget about that, but now, if we had 28 teams, could be a lot different. Of course, that's been a topic recently, or possibly expanding to 32. But yeah, so I didn't remember that part until I looked it up. Of course, Twitter wasn't around in 2002, but I can imagine the hot takes flying if Twitter was around in 2002 and, the contraction was that close to happening. It's definitely fun to kind of look back and
see how the dominoes fell.
Exactly. Okay, now let's take a look at the roster. Now, just to refresh everyone's memory, the rules are you go back 25 years. So for the purpose of this, we go back to 1995. You pick one player every year. You cannot repeat a player, and you have to form a coherent roster. That means the player has to be playing the position that he played that year. There's some leeway in the outfield, if you feel like he could play center or play right or whatever. And so you need, starting catcher, backup catcher, all that kind of stuff, 5-man rotation, as well as a bullpen. So now getting into the roster, some of these names may be familiar, some of these not as familiar. So starting at catcher from 1995, we have Darren Fletcher, slightly above average with the stick. He hit 286 that year. Moving along to first base, we have Brad Wilkerson from 2004, a solid season, 5.1 of WAR, hit 32 bombs. Both those guys are lefties, so it's nice to have a couple lefty hitters. Then moving to second base, we got a switch hitter, Jose Vidro from 2002. Decent average that year, hit 315. I think going over to third, couple good choices at third to go with. Starting at third, we're going to go with Zimmerman from 2009, Mr. National. 7.3 WAR, hit 33 bombs, drove in 106 to be exact. Then the shortstop, switch hitter, Christian Guzman from 2008. He hit 316, but it's kind of an empty 316. It's tough to find a great offensive shortstop, but he was He was decent with the glove, so that's who we're going with as short. Now heading to the outfield. In left, we got Alfonso Soriano. Do you remember anything about Alfonso Soriano? Any historical feats that he accomplished?
Well, I remember that he swung like a size 52-inch bat. That's what I remember about Alfonso Soriano. Historical feats, Alfonso Soriano?
He can be mentioned with Canseco, Bonds, and A-Rod.
Ooh.
40,
that's right.
Yeah, and actually, that's the year we got. So in 06, he hit 46 bombs, stole 41 bags. With that huge bat, he struck out 160 times. But yeah, definitely had some pop out there. Moving to center, we got Rondell White in 98. And then as we slide over to right field, we get Bryce Harper in his monster season in 2015. MVP season for him, worth 9.7 wins. Led the league in home runs with 42. Led the league in runs, 118. As well as on-base percentage, 460. Slugging at 649. And OPS, obviously, at 1109. OPS plus of 198. Huge year from Harper there in 2015.
Yeah, I mean, you couldn't get him out that year. I mean, it was kind of Bonds-esque, where people were just walking him. And Harper has a great eye, so he's not going to offer it something. And he can almost, like Bonds, sniff it out in the middle of the at-bat that you don't want anything to do with him. So he just took his walk when he needed to take his walk. But, you know, that was the year where you're like, oh, boy, now this guy's turning into who we all knew he was going to turn into.
Yeah, and we kind of expected that to be a regular thing. You know, we see that with Trout. Trout's consistent year in and year out, MVP caliber performance, and Bryce Harper certainly had that in 2015, but that's kind of only been, you know, that year has been an outlier for him. He's been a superstar, but he hasn't had that MVP level production in any other year, has he?
He's been a superstar because he's marketable, but he hasn't been a superstar like Trout, like where he's putting up number after number after year. Now the walks are always there, but I always wonder, you know, is he getting a little bit more credit than the player that he is? You know, I mean, if they didn't walk him, if they attacked him, what would this guy put up as monstrous numbers, or was it always a function of, well, they didn't necessarily respect who was hitting around him or something, and it was just the smarter strategic play to pitch around him? But who Bryce Harper is, how much he's getting paid versus kind of what his BB ref says don't necessarily match up.
That's true. Yeah, and definitely, I mean, being on the cover of Sports Illustrated at 16 definitely helps feed into that, you know, the hype machine and the image of him.
But if I said, what does he make, $330 million, 13 years, 330, and I think if we pulled up his BREF page, you would be like, all right, like who's the 1980s version of Bryce Harper? Like, is he Dale Murphy? Who is, you know what I mean? Like, I would love to really dig in there and see who he is, because I think that's what I'm saying is I think if I really dug into numbers and looked at the player and said, okay, a left-handed hitting, right-handed throwing right fielder, like, has a good throwing arm, but he's kind of a zoo on defense as far as his routes and his range and all that. Base running, let's just call it a neutral, you know, and there's a lot of pop there, and he definitely gets on base. I mean, he's like Bryce Harper's an all-star. I'm just saying, kind of the perception versus who he is he's not quite, I think.
Yeah, he's kind of perceived, he's in that conversation among the best players in the league.
Right, Trout and Betts and those guys. And,
yeah, but I don't know if he's deservedly so. Now, he came up at such a young age. He did things at 19 and 20 that hadn't been done. You know, you go back to guys like Mantle
Miggy,
and Griffey, guys who came up young, guys who were absolute studs, and you know, he did things at a young age that is very rare. But you know, now he's into his prime age-wise, but yeah, he hasn't had that consistency.
Right. Well, and he's a big, thick guy, and he's got a high torque kind of high leverage kind of approach to hitting.
Definitely, yeah.
Is
max
that guy
effort
going to be
swing.
healthy in his mid-30s?
We'll see. Time will tell.
Yeah. I'm not trying to hate on Bryce Harper. The guy's an all-star. He's an incredible player. I just, I think the reason I bring up those questions is you talked about the 2015 year, and it's kind of like, well, why isn't this, the standard season?
And then as we move along, that was basically the starting lineup. Now the bench, we've got a couple infielders. We've got Daniel Murphy from 2016. Huge offensive year for him. 47 doubles, led the league, hit 347. Led the league in slugging and OPS at 595 and 985 respectively. Now that, of course, was on the heels of his monster playoff run in 2015. He parlayed that into that big contract with the Nationals. And, he certainly continued to hit there in 2016.
Murphy, obviously, second half of 15, and especially the playoffs, when I think he hit 8 home runs in the playoffs, turned into Babe Ruth all of a sudden. And
yeah, don't remind me.
Yeah, and did it all off of frontline pitchers too. I think his postseason home runs were Kershaw, a pair off of Greinke, Arrieta, on and on and on. He was hitting home runs off the top guys, but the Mets didn't offer Murphy a competitive contract because up until that point he was a serviceable guy, but he was now on the other side of 30. He was an all offensive player. He wasn't very good defensively, base running, all of that stuff. In fact, it used to be a joke amongst Mets fans. Like, the guy would do something, he was like the toot blonde king, And I think he was motivated when the Mets didn't offer him a competitive contract, and the Nats, seeing him all the time, jumped on it, and then he just kept hitting, and it was really quite amazing to see.
And then the other infielder we've got on the bench, Anthony Rendon from last year, from 2019. A huge year from him, led the league in doubles with 44 and RBIs with 126. Hit 319, got on base over 400, slugging percentage just a hair under 600. So huge year from him. I mean, that's quite the pinch hitting options off the bench with Murphy and Rendon. Or you could start Murphy at second and then bring in Vidro off the bench for defense. Then in the outfield, we've got Jason Worth in 2013. Hit 25 bombs that year, on base, hair under 400. Solid year from him. And Vladimir Guerrero from 2000 back in Montreal hit 44 bombs that year.
Yeah.
Batting average of 345. So, a couple of great choices in right field between Vladdy and Bryce Harper. Then backing up at catcher, we've got Chris Widger from 99 with 1.1 wins. So that's who we've got, lineup-wise.
An omission here, I think, from the catching. When I think of the Nats catching over the time, and I don't know if the stats would bear me out here. Early on, they had a guy, Brian Schneider, who, was a 650 to 715 OPS type of a guy, but he was kind of known in baseball as one of the good receivers and good catch and throw guys. And then the other guys, as a guy who's an absolute Mets killer, and he's part of the current squad, is Wilson Ramos, who, in 2016, you went with the Daniel Murphy season, and rightfully so. I mean, that was an amazing season by Murph to hit 347 and everything. But that year, Ramos got MVP votes, and he was a Silver Slugger as a catcher, 850 OPS, 22 bombs. So Ramos would hit 4th or 5th or 6th for them, which not very many modern catchers are that much of an offensive threat.
Right, yeah, no, that was definitely one of the tough decisions to make. Yeah, as you look on this roster, catcher is probably the weakest link. And yeah, Ramos, he pretty much took the words out of my mouth. That was one of the tough decisions of who to take in 2016, Murphy or Ramos. Ultimately I went with Murphy and his the offense that he provided that year. But somebody else doing this exercise, they may definitely go with Wilson Ramos. Then moving along to the pitching. Starting it off, now this the rotation is in no particular order, but first name mentioned is usually a guy who is an ace, and that is Pedro Martinez from 97. Minuscule ERA, 1.9, led the league. Now here's a number you don't see very often anymore. He led the league in complete games with 13. 13 complete games. He had 4 shutouts, which actually did not lead the league. He went 17-8 that year. Struck out 305, which did not lead the league, surprisingly. He did lead the league in ERA plus at 219, in FIP at 239, in WHIP, hits per 9, and strikeouts per 9. Struck out 11.4 dudes per 9, and he was a Cy Young winner that year. Then moving along, we've got Javier Vasquez from 01. Had an ERA of 3.42. We took Max Scherzer in 2018. He was worth 9.2 wins that year. Led the league in wins, went 18-7. Now he led the league in complete games and shutouts, even though he was nowhere near Pedro's numbers. He had 2 complete games and 1 shutout, which both of those led the league in 2018.
Oh my gosh!
So we can see
how much the game's changed in 20 years.
Exactly. He struck out 300 dudes, led the league. Also hit 12 guys. A little bit of nucleolution in that year. Led the league in 12 hit by pitches. And led the league in WHIP, hits per 9, strikeouts per 9, and strikeouts per walk. There's a notable exception on his stat line that year, or more his mantle that year. Despite all those, he did not win the Cy Young.
What year is this?
This is 2018.
18. Am I supposed to guess who won the Cy Young in 18?
I would think you would remember that one.
Oh, that's DeGrom.
Yeah. So Scherzer, we did not get, because Scherzer won. He's got Cy Youngs, but we decided to take a non-Cy Young year for him. I figured that this
quote non-Cy Young. I mean, it took DeGrom to have like a 1.7 ERA to beat him out.
Yeah, Scherzer's ERA was 2.5. Moving along to another ERA of 2.5, we've got Steven Strasburg in 2017. He went 15-4, and he led the league in FIP, and he was an all-star that year. And rounding out the rotation, we've got Jordan Zimmerman in 2014. His ERA clocks in under 3 at 2.66, and he was led the league in walks per 9, just 1.3 walks per 9 innings. And moving along to the bullpen, not a lot of closers that we selected, or at least guys who closed that year. We've got Luis Ayala from 03, ERA sub 3 ERA that year. Chad Cordero, he was a closer in 05, huge year for him. ERA of 1.82, saved 47 games, which led the league.
Chad Cordero, Cal State Fullerton.
That's right.
First round pick, and that was a little window, a tiny window, where the teams were picking relievers in the first round because they could take them right into like the September playoff run, and so they were foregoing, take the high school shortstop and let him develop for 5 years for if I can get Chad Cordero, I put him in the bullpen, and that's like a trade piece in July. So that Chad Cordero is one of the guys I remember from that sort of a strategy. Royce Ring for the White Sox and then traded to the Mets was a guy that I remember from that strategy too that did not work quite as well as Chad Cordero.
So yeah, Cordero, arguably the best reliever we've got in the bunch here. We've got the lefty Sean Burnett from 2010. He had an ERA of 2.14. Tyler Clippard in 2011 was not the closer, did not record any saves actually, but he did have 88 innings out of the pen with a sub 2 ERA, 1.83. Struck out 104 batters. So definitely a weapon out of the pen.
Yeah, he was elite at that time. He'd change up or split, whatever it was that he would use. Yeah.
Then we've got Craig Stammen in 2012. Mel Rojas in 1996 gave you 81 innings out of the pen, saved 36. And John Roush in 07 led the league in games with 88 appearances.
Big dude, like 6'7", 6'8", or something like that. 6'10". What was he?
Yeah,
He was huge.
He was a big guy, yeah. So that's the pitching staff. Any thoughts on the pitching staff?
Yeah, don't forget, folks, how good Javi Vasquez was back at that time. There was a window there where he was a really, really quality starting pitcher, like a big-time number 2 on a team. And 220 innings, man. You know, he was legit.
Yeah, and that was, in 01, there was a lot of, back then it wasn't the ball that was necessarily juiced. So, which, his ERA of 3.4, it's not as sparkling as Scherzer and Strasburg and Zimmerman's sub 3 ERAs, but yeah, slightly different game back then.
Absolutely.
Now, in creating any of these rosters, there's tough decisions to make. We already touched on one of those positions with catcher, as we missed out on Ramos and Schneider. Had to go with Widger and Darren Fletcher. But, there's some other guys who missed the roster as well. I think pitching, we did a pretty good job here. I mean, do you notice any huge omissions with the rotation that I may have missed?
No, I think you pretty much got the main guys. I mean, you remember Jordan Zimmerman was a big piece there for them as Strasburg was coming along. Everybody's going to think Scherzer, Strasburg, Pedro, we get to kind of cheat and bring him back in, as a former Expo.
Yeah, there is one other former Expo who actually had a good year back, at the start of this, and that was Jeff Facero. I don't even know if you remember the lefty. Jeff Facero had a good year for them. I went a different direction when he had a great year.
Yeah. It's tough to argue with your top 5. It's pretty solid.
Yeah, and Scherzer, though, as you mentioned him, we didn't really mention it a moment ago, but Scherzer, of course, huge free agent contract with the Nationals.
Mm-hmm. Bets on himself. Yeah.
And, I mean, a lot of times those don't pay out, do they?
Don't I believe it, man. I mean, Scherzer signs, and my first instinct as a Mets fan is like, okay, so this guy's legit, but he's got kind of a high effort delivery. He's coming over from the American League. This guy, he's on his 3rd team. So in my mind, I'm kind of like, God, they gave him a lot of money. And if this doesn't work, that's the type of contract that completely hamstrings your roster, right?
Yeah, and he signed a 7-year deal,
7-year, 220 or something like that.
Yeah.
And
you're thinking, 1 or 2 years, he's gonna start to taper off.
Correct. And then Scherzer's gonna be this mediocre dude going 14 and 12.
Barry Zito Part 2.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that would be best case scenario. But yeah, even if he's just mediocre, he's not a 1. He's chewing up so much of your payroll.
Right.
But the Nats aren't afraid to spend money and buy their way out of bad decisions, and B, it never happened. The complete opposite happened. And Scherzer turns into this guy who I think is, probably second to Kershaw in the National League throughout that whole, run, I mean,
absolutely.
DeGrom's trying to get there as of recent, but I mean, Scherzer's had a heck of a run. How many, off the top of my head, I'm thinking, how many Cy Youngs does he have?
He's got...
multiple, right?
Yeah,
okay.
Definitely. Because he won in Detroit.
Uh-huh.
As well as Washington.
So. And then he has a bunch of top 5 finishes, too. It seems like just about every year the guy's in the top 5, right?
Absolutely, yeah.
Pretty amazing.
He's definitely been a worthwhile signing.
Yeah.
And then now, as we look at the batters, the position players, is there anybody who you look up and down that roster who you would expect to see but is not there?
Position players. I'm sorry, I had it on my pitchers there for a second. Well, just thinking about the Nats earlier, we talked about Trey Turner. Like, he probably hasn't had a monster year yet. But again, and I'm not diving into stats here, I'm going off of the perception of when this guy's up, in a critical spot, and I'm the fan of the opposing team. He makes me nervous. The Mets pitchers have a difficulty holding runners, and so he just goes crazy with his foot speed. I remember he's the guy that the Mets didn't draft when I had done research, and I was hoping they would draft. And so to see him kind of have to go against him all the time is difficult. That's one guy that I was thinking of. Second guy was maybe for a split second Ian Desmond.
Yeah, Ian Desmond, I think in 2013 he had a pretty big year. Ultimately I went with Jason Worth in 2013, and that is kind of...
Let me ask you a question as a Dodgers fan. Is it all right that I outed you as a Dodgers fan on this podcast?
Of course.
Do you remember when Jason Worth signed away from the Dodgers, and were you like heartbroken, like, oh my God, that guy's the best baseball's in front of him, or did you just think kind of like is he your Justin Turner?
No, that would be, I feel like Beltre probably
right.
was the one who got it, because Beltre was a homegrown guy too. Jason Worth, I want to say, came up with the Orioles, right?
As a catcher,
the
right?
baby face guy and the glasses. Look at that picture of him, and then look at him now, a completely different guy. But he kind of.
But I mean, Beltre hit 49 home runs the year before.
48. Maybe.
48 the year before he signed with Seattle. Yeah. So that's a homegrown superstar leaving. I'm talking about a guy who's like a fourth outfielder bench type guy who blossoms.
Yeah, he was a guy though that was never really consistently healthy. So at the time you're thinking like, I don't really know if it's worth it to commit all this to him. I think he had wrist injuries.
Right.
And so at the time I could see the hesitancy to signing him. But then, of course, he goes to Philadelphia.
Right.
Was an important piece for them. And I think he gets kind of forgotten in Washington. He was a great player for them for several years.
Yep. Jason Worth is a great player because, again, Mets had to go against him in both Philly and Washington. And he was just that critical kind of like, he's almost like Dennis Rodman. Like he's kind of the third guy, but he's still all-star caliber, really good.
Yeah, so kind of went Worth over Desmond there.
Yeah, but Desmond struck out a zillion times and was kind of one-dimensional. But I mean, he is a guy that I remember being a pretty darn good player.
Yeah, and that was while he was still playing shortstop. Then I think he's kicked around at first base and the outfield since then.
Yeah, Colorado, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But he, the one kind of weakness here, we don't really have a backup shortstop. Murphy is definitely not going to provide much with the leather. Rendon, I'm assuming if you have to, you slide him over to short. But yeah, that's what we got. It was tough to kind of find a spot, like we just mentioned, for Trey Turner and Desmond. The years just didn't work out for them. On the flip side, I feel like it was pretty easy to get Scherzer's best year. As we mentioned, it was not a Cy Young year for him, but I feel like that was his best year. It worked out well. And Harper had that one monster year, and it was easy to line that one up. So that kind of made up those easy decisions, made up for the tough decisions.
I'd put I'd get Rendon in the starting lineup somehow as a first baseman or a second baseman. That would be the only thing that I would do. But I mean, I like the roster.
Yeah, I mean, would you go with who would you put at third defensively, Zimmerman or Rendon? Because then you can just.
You can't miss. Young Zimmerman was a pretty darn good third baseman.
Yeah, I think we kind of forget about that now as he's had that shoulder trouble, throwing the ball over as he's moved over to first base.
Right. Because remember, young Zimmerman, he's from Virginia. He's drafted around the same time as Wright, David Wright. So they're both growing up playing on the same travel team, and then they're both the third baseman, young cornerstones of the two teams that at the time it wasn't a rivalry, in whatever 06 or whatever. The Mets are really good and the Nats are losing 100 games, but Zimmerman stuck around all the way and he's still going, which is amazing, especially after the shoulder thing. And he had a year or two, if my memory serves, where he was just lost. And he was able to kind of rework his swing and come back.
Yeah, it looked like he was washed. He had those injuries. It looked like, he was done. And he, to his credit, he stuck through it and continued to play. And, good for him. He got a ring playing for the Nationals this year.
Mm-hmm.
So now we'll get into grading the roster, and it's kind of something that we've been touching along as we've been going. But definitely one of the strengths that I see here is the starting pitchers.
Indeed.
Yeah, we've got Pedro, huge year. Scherzer, obviously, in Strasburg. We've mentioned it throughout the podcast. But definitely those starters are a strength. The bullpen, on the other hand, I feel like is a bit of a weak point. We don't really have a dominant reliever in there. Clippard is the guy in this group, and Cordero, of course, had a great year. But other than that, we don't really have a dominant guy. When you're putting these rosters together over 25 years, you think that you could find more than 2 dominant years out of relievers.
It's always been the Nats' Achilles heel. That's how you beat them, that you get to their bullpen, and that's when they were susceptible. In 2015, when the Mets won the division, which is just kind of now in history an outlier year around that window of dominance by the Nats, who have pretty much had a firm grasp on the NL East. Even it's almost laughable. Every year, people are making cases for a new team that's going to jump. Oh, the Phillies now, they made all these moves, or the Mets, and then it's the Nats again, right? It's almost getting boring in the consistency. But their Achilles heel has always been the bullpen. And in 2015, the year the Mets beat them, was because these guys that they had run out just were running out of gas, and they didn't have a closer. They didn't address it at the deadline. They continued to rotate guys around, and it was, it killed them, and they just blew tons of late leads. That was the feeling, I think, of why they wouldn't win those playoff series, is they really didn't know who to go to in the bullpen,
Mm-hmm.
And so even if I remember last year, it seems like 100 years ago with everything that's been going on, but did starters come out of the pen for them in the playoffs last year?
They did, yeah. I know Scherzer came in and threw the 8th inning of a game against the Dodgers. I want to say Strasburg came in out of the pen once. I know that Corbin did as well. Corbin definitely did. So I may be wrong about Strasburg. And but that was definitely the plan was to get into that pen, and then they were going to struggle. To his credit, Daniel Hudson last year did a good job in the playoffs.
True.
And Sean Doolittle, I think, as well. But
I can also tell you that, and I remember having this conversation with you, and I feel like I put a hex on it, like reverse jinxed it, but Strasburg didn't have much of a big game reputation for a long time, and I don't know if that was fair, because if you look at his numbers, they've always been pretty good, and it could be because he kind of comes off as kind of like more soft-spoken, but
and how much of that also do you think
the restriction
does 2012 come into play there?
100% it does. 100% it does, because then it's like he's timid or passive or whatever. I can remember a game in 2013. Was it 13 or 14? It was pretty early in the year. I think it was early 14. Matt Harvey's pitching against Steven Strasburg, And both of those, I was just thinking today's the 10-year anniversary when the Mets drafted Harvey. Okay. And thinking about one guy was prudent and sat out, and the other guy said forget it and was a bulldog, right? And in the short term, Harvey looked like the hero, but now he's struggling to find a place to play, and he's been battling injuries ever since. While Strasburg's the MVP of the World Series last year, right? So now it looks like it, but at the time, Strasburg would get beat up in big games and wouldn't pitch well in the flesh or whatever. So there's a game in 2014 where Harvey's pitching against Strasburg, and Citi Field's chanting, "Harvey's better." I mean, if you go on YouTube, you can see it. I mean, that was the perception at the time, that like Strasburg kind of shrunk and never really came through. But I mean, you look at the guy's stuff, and he's amazing. And
Absolutely.
I'm curious to see where he goes even from here. Like now that the whole playoff monkey's off their back, does this guy blossom into a top 5 pitcher in the game? It's quite possible.
It is, yeah. We'll see. There's definitely a lot of competition right now. There's a lot of great pitchers in the league, but yeah, he's got that kind of moxie from the playoffs last year. So again, that starting rotation is the strength, and the bullpen is a weak point. As a whole, that pitching staff, great strikeouts per 9. Comparing it to all the other rosters that I did, they're among the best at strikeouts per 9 and walks per 9. So, of course, strikeouts per walks as well. And as a whole, their ERA is just over 2.5. So, solid ERA from the pitching, from the entire pitching staff. Offensively, not great numbers. Kind of below average there. In some of the stuff, their strength offensively, they've got some decent rate stats. Batting average of 306 as a group. On base at 381, slugging at 539. So solid rate stats from them. Not as much in the counting stats. They did hit 351 home runs, so decent there. But do you have any other comments offensively from this roster?
The more recent Nationals teams are pretty deep. They lengthen out, and I think some of that comes with, like I mentioned, Ramos getting offense out of the catching position, Murphy getting offense out of the second base position has helped them. But yeah, when I think Nats originally, it was pretty tough for them their first 5 years or so. I mean, those were some really challenged teams. 08 they lose 102, 09 they lose 103. So they were struggling there in the transition for sure.
Yeah, so I think overall, comparing this all the other rosters, with the strengths and weaknesses that this one has, I think they're kind of in the middle of the pack there. I'd probably give this maybe a C+, B- based on the being carried mainly by that rotation.
Mm-hmm.
Finishing up here, we've got our final thoughts. You've kind of been touching on a lot of things throughout this podcast, but what are some of your kind of final thoughts about the Expo/Nationals organization, this roster that we have, and what they've been doing in the past 25 years?
With all due respect to Mike Rizzo, the GM, we've forgotten the most valuable player in the rise of the Nationals. Do you know who that is?
I'm not sure. Is he still with the team?
It depends on how you look at it. What do Bryce Harper, Anthony Rendon, Jason Worth, Max Scherzer, Steven Strasburg, Gio Gonzalez, another guy that we never mentioned, who was a pretty darn good pitcher.
I have a sense of where you're going with this.
What do they all have in common?
Are they all represented by Scott Boras?
That's correct. So there's always this feeling that Boras and Rizzo, they worked well together, and so the Nats weren't afraid of drafting a Boras client, knowing that they could pay the freight, and they always seem to take his recommendations on free agent signings. So, that buzzsaw is metaphorical for Scott Boras.
Yeah, definitely. And when I went back through this experience, going back to the, starting with the Expos, obviously 1994, everyone talks about the Expos, what could have been, what could have been, what could have been. 94 obviously just was a season of what could have been. But after that, you don't really remember anything from the Expos, at least I certainly don't. They were kind of just like there. And then they go to Washington, and as the Nationals, of course, like we mentioned, in recent years, they've been such a great organization. They've built well through the draft, and they're just, a somewhat model organization. They've complemented their draft picks and building that with astute free agent signings like Scherzer. But what I forgot was just how bad they were for those first 5 years in DC, first 6 years in DC. Mm-hmm. Just pretty terrible. And yeah, some of those years it was tough to find players that were great. So I think with the the recency bias that we have and looking at the Nets, you forget how bad they were there, and that's to the credit of the team that has been built that you do forget those down years.
And if you look at, like I said, 2018 they go 82 and 80, 2015 they go 83 and 79. 2011 they go 80 and 81. In my mind, this team feels like they've won 95 games every year for a decade. That's how they feel because, like you said, you have that respect for the structure. Mm-hmm. They have the starting pitching staff. Their lineup is deep. They have superstar power. They have all-stars sprinkled around. They have high draft picks sprinkled around. Aside from the bullpen, can you put a team together better than they're constructed?
They've done pretty well, and yeah, they taken advantage of those high draft picks. We see some guys who have missed, but yeah, the draft picks that we kind of highlighted there, Zimmerman, Rendon, Strasburg, and Harper, they've hit with all those guys, and those guys have been cornerstones of this organization. So it's been fun looking back at the
not for me
Nats and Expos. And fun little experience here as we start our quarter century rosters.
I have one final thing to say is that, they're the World Series champs, and hat tip to them. And they beat the Astros, who now in retrospect, we all love that fact. But I thought incorrectly a couple of years ago, there was the countdown to when Harper was going to become a free agent, when Strasburg was going to become a free agent. And the thought was, or at least the kind of consensus was at the time, that that's their window to win it. And if they don't win it by then, boom. So this narrative, winning the World Series has completely flipped the narrative. Where it was, they were kind of like our Braves, right? Okay, they win 95 games every year, but then they go lose in the playoffs, and then you just thought, well, Harper's going to leave and Strasburg, and then it's all going to split. Rendon's going to leave. It's all going to just fall apart, right? And they were able to get it done last year.
They were, yeah.
And Harper's gone now, and Rendon's gone now, and all that, and we'll see what kind of a team they are moving forward. But I would, if I had to bet, I would bet that. Guess what? People are probably going to say when the preseason predictions come out this year, if they play, it'll be like, well, look at the Braves and look at the. I'm still betting on the Nationals
They're,
until I see otherwise.
Yeah, they are the champs until somebody knocks them off, and unfortunately, it may be a while until we get that chance. So, Terry, thank you for joining me here today.
For sure.
Appreciate your insight on these National League East teams, and as we started here with the Nats, look forward to having you joining us again. Make sure to follow us on Twitter at Boxseat Banter, and you can follow me at WBallis. We're also on Instagram at Boxseat Banter, and visit the website boxseatbanter.com, where you can see the full roster of the Nationals, as well as a link to the roster with all of the stats. And we look forward to having you joining us again next week. As for now, this is Billy Ballas of Boxseat Banter, signing off.